Ma'am, this area is for family and distinguished guests only. PFC Langley's voice cut through the air rigid and cold like a steel barrier. Rachel Hayes didn't move. She stood at the entrance, her eyes quietly fixed on the section where General Harper's funeral was taking place. No tears, no explanation, only a stillness so steady it unsettled those watching. Langley tightened the strap of his cap and repeated the order more forcefully this time, as if her calmness itself was provoking him. He pointed toward the hill designated for civilians trying to push away someone he believed did not belong. Rachel reached gently into her pocket and took out a worn challenge coin, an emblem anyone who had truly seen the battlefield would recognize instantly. But Langley only gave it a brief glance, frowning in irritation, completely unaware of its meaning. A larger figure approached. Sergeant Rourke. He eyed the coin, then Rachel from head to toe, before letting out a mocking scoff. A pilot, huh? Sure. Everyone thinks they knew the general. Several officers paused mid-stride. They watched. None intervened. Disdain spread through the atmosphere like an oil slick across a solemn ceremony. Rourke planted his hands on his hips and lowered his voice threateningly. Walk to the public area right now or I'll call the MPs to escort you. Rachel's expression didn't change. Sergeant, I'm not standing here by mistake. The sound of boots approached from behind. First, Sergeant Keller stepped forward, his face carved in stone, his eyes locked on the MEDEVAC patch hanging from Rachel's bag. Then he delivered the sentence that froze the entire space: fraudulent wear of insignia. Impersonation false wear of a military emblem. A cold shiver ran through everyone nearby. Some officers turned their heads. Some families fell silent. The air dropped into a heavy, suffocating stillness. Rachel lifted her eyes and stared directly into Keller's. Her voice sliced through their arrogance like a blade. You have no idea who you're talking to. In that moment, the real conflict began, and it would overturn the entire state funeral. If you believe true courage isn't found in the sound of gunfire, but in the quiet strength of those who walked through war, then subscribe to Veterans Legacy Stories and help us preserve the dignity, memory, and honor of our silent heroes. Rachel stood still before the honor cordon, showing no reaction to the firmness of the three soldiers trying to push her away from the place she needed to stand. Her eyes remained locked on the section where General Harper's funeral was being held, where the folded flag rested on a black velvet-covered table. Even as they blocked her path, she showed no hint of hesitation or confusion. Her calmness only made the three soldiers more irritated, as if they were confronting someone who refused to obey, yet offered no argument. Rachel shifted her stance slightly, and her old brown bag tilted just enough to reveal the MEDEVAC Dustoff 71 patch. The faded stitching recalled a time when every flight was a wager between life and death, and just seeing it pulled a gust of memory from the battlefields of Afghanistan into her mind. The roar of rotor blades pounding behind her, urgent casualty reports crackling through the radio, a pair of dirt-stained boots dragging a stretcher into the cabin, a blood-soaked hand gripping the seat rail, a young soldier whispering his mother's name through a broken breath, hot dust clinging to the oxygen mask, the burn of engine oil mixing with the metallic scent of blood. Everything came back so fast, she had to close her eyes for a second, then open them just as quickly. And then the familiar call sign echoed in her memory, clear, as if spoken right where she stood. Valkyrie, confirm your position. We have serious casualties. That call sign had once been the lifeline for an entire company pinned down in Arandana Valley. It was the reason she descended into the kill zone 3 times in a row, even when her tail rotor was shredded and her windshield fractured like a spiderweb. It was what kept 17 soldiers, breathing men whose names she never fully learned. Standing now in the quiet of Arlington, the memory did not make her tremble. It made her stand taller. As if every worn thread on that patch reminded her that she survived through discipline, unwavering resolve, and a promise never to leave anyone behind. The soldiers blocking her had no way of seeing any of that. PFC Langley looked at her with defensive confusion. Sergeant Rourke looked at her as if she were trying to cling to someone else's glory. First, Sergeant Keller stared at the dust-off patch as though it was evidence of a lie. None of them knew she was the one who pulled General Harper out of the Valley of Death years ago. None of them knew she had sat in a shaking cockpit so violent it felt moments away from ripping apart when her Black Hawk had only minutes left before crashing. And none of them knew she stood here today not to demand anything, but to keep an old promise to the man who had once placed absolute trust in her. Rachel drew in a deep breath, not to summon courage, but to preserve the calmness that had been carved into her bones through years of witnessing how fragile human life truly was. She knew she didn't need to say much. What she had done in war never needed to be spoken aloud to prove anything to the people before her. And it was precisely that silence so deep it made the three soldiers glance at one another that widened the gap between them and the truth. A gap that would soon expose every mistake they were about to make. At that very moment, Rachel's quiet composure unintentionally became the spark that allowed the first accusations to form in the minds of the men standing across from her. First, Sergeant Keller stepped forward, his boots striking the ground with a heaviness that felt like a warning. He stood so close Rachel could smell the faint mix of coffee and cigarette smoke lingering on his collar. He didn't have to raise his voice. Every word he spoke carried the weight of a military order meant to be obeyed. "Ma'am, I'll say this one last time. Leave this area immediately." There was no gentleness, no attempt to understand, just a wall of authority trying to push her away from the sacred ceremony taking place ahead. Rachel didn't react harshly. She opened her bag, pulled out her worn VA ID, and raised it with both hands, a gesture of respect. Keller looked at the card for only a few seconds. Then he pushed it back with a dismissive flick of his hand. "This means nothing here." It wasn't rejection, it was erasure. The words struck something deep inside Rachel, a place she thought she had left behind in Afghanistan. But her face remained calm, as though she had long grown accustomed to a world that judged what it saw rather than what it couldn't see. A nearby officer, likely a lieutenant colonel, tilted his head toward his colleague, whispering. The other replied with quiet concern. Soft murmurs drifted through the air, like grains of sand carried by the wind, unclear but sharp enough to mark her as the center of suspicion. Keller continued, his tone turning more superior. "You were causing a disturbance at a state funeral." Rachel stayed silent. The accusation wasn't true, but it revealed how far Keller was straying beyond the duty of a ceremonial guard. He leaned in, eyes narrowing at the Dustoff patch stitched onto her bag. Then he delivered a blow that could cut through the honor of any veteran. "And you may face charges for fraudulent wear of military insignia." The entire area froze for a beat. A few eyes widened. A few heads jerked up. The insult wasn't just aimed at the woman before them, it sliced into the memory of those who had died under that insignia. Rachel didn't flinch. She took a deep breath, holding herself upright the way she once did in a cockpit, filled with smoke and gunfire. Her eyes settled on Keller, no anger, no resentment, only a sorrow too quiet to name. "I understand what you're saying," she replied softly, but clearly. "But you don't understand who you're talking to." Keller hesitated. Not because he grasped his mistake, but because he wasn't used to being met with such composure from someone he was trying to intimidate. Her calmness made him feel as though he had overlooked something important, yet his pride refused to let him pause long enough to see it. A group of younger officers stopped behind them. A female lieutenant covered her mouth at the words fraudulent insignia. A major folded his arms, his eyes shifting between Keller and Rachel with deepening doubt. Quiet whispers began to ripple through the rows of seats. Everyone watched the woman being treated like an intruder, and none of them knew she was the one who had once pulled wounded soldiers from Harper's own unit out of a death valley. Rachel held that calm gaze. No one could hear her heartbeat, but if they had, they would have found it steady and slow, just like it had been in the cockpit years ago. It was the rhythm of someone who had survived far worse than 3 soldiers trying to push her away. Someone had once taught her dignity doesn't need to argue. It stands on its own even in the middle of misunderstanding. Today, that dignity stood at the entrance of a 4-star general's funeral, and no one realized they were facing the very woman General Harper had once called the last wings of the unit. But silence alone wasn't enough to change the course of events. Not yet. Because just as Keller prepared to take another step, another pair of eyes watching from a distance caught sight of everything. Eyes that had stood beside Harper on the battlefield. Eyes that knew the name Rachel Hayes was not one to be dismissed. And in that moment, the path opened for the first person who would recognize the truth no one else could see. From a distance in the shade of a great oak tree, CSM Porter stood silently. He was not the kind of man who meddled in matters outside his duty, but something about the woman being pressured by the guards kept him from looking away. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't weakness. It was the calm of someone who had seen what they had never seen. He noticed Rachel's bag. The MEDEVAC Dustoff 71 patch was so old its colors had nearly faded. He knew that patch never belonged on anyone seeking attention. It belonged only to the loyalty of someone who had pulled comrades back from the edge of death. A surge of memory hit Porter like a blow. He remembered Harper's Tactical Operations Center years ago. The maps spread across the table. The urgent incoming calls, the heavy breaths that felt like the world itself was tightening. That night, Harper's reconnaissance unit had been ambushed in Arandana Valley. Gunfire bursting in waves, casualty reports pouring in. No air support, no escape route. Everyone knew they were losing minutes fast. Then, through the static-filled radio, a woman's voice came through so calm that anyone who had been there would remember it for life. "Sir, you have wounded and I have room." Harper froze. Porter stood beside him. Everyone knew that landing zone was suicide. Harper issued the refusal. His voice sharpened, "Negative, Valkyrie. Do not enter that zone." But the reply came immediately clear, decisive, like a blade cutting through the night. "I'm going in." No one in the TOC ever forgot that moment. No one forgot the sound of rotor blades trembling through the radio even as the antenna was riddled with bullets. No one forgot how she landed 3 times to pull the wounded out. No one forgot Harper's eyes when he heard the final report, 17 survivors. Valkyrie is returning. From that moment, Porter had been grateful to the unnamed pilot. And today he realized the pilot was standing right in front of him, being treated like a fraud. Porter's chest tightened. He pulled out his phone. His fingers trembled not from age, but from years of restrained anger. The call connected on the second ring. Dalton. "General, this is Porter. I'm at Harper's funeral. Is something wrong, Madge?" General Dalton's voice dropped as if he could sense trouble. Porter didn't mince words. "They're trying to remove someone from the gate. Rachel Hayes." A sharp silence followed. Porter heard Dalton push back his chair and stand abruptly. He added voice-tightening Dustoff patch. "MEDEVAC. Call sign Valkyrie." Dalton muttered a pained curse under his breath. Then he spoke quickly. "Keep her there. Don't let her leave." The sound of rapid typing erupted on the other end. Dalton opened her file. Distinguished Service Cross. 2 distinguished flying crosses. A silver star. Multiple air medals marked with the V for valor. A record thick as a book of battlefield history, yet carrying a rare, humble silence. Dalton steadied his voice. "God." Harper once said if he had to name the bravest person he ever served with, he would say her name. Porter closed his eyes briefly. Dalton continued now with absolute resolve. "Stay with her. I'm coming. This ends now." Porter ended the call, drew in a long breath, and looked toward Rachel. His gaze no longer held mere observation, but the respect owed to someone he and Harper had been indebted to for years without ever having the chance to say so. He took 1 step forward, a single step enough to confirm to himself that he would not allow the humiliation to continue another second. And as Porter began to move, a distant sound signaled the arrival of those who would turn everything upside down. The tension at the funeral gate had not settled when the distant sound of engines began to move slowly toward them. No sirens, no noise, but each black vehicle that appeared carried a weight that made everyone nearby instinctively stand straighter. The government convoy rolled forward like a dark current entering the restricted zone, leaving absolute silence in its wake. PFC Langley shot a glance at Sergeant Rourke. Neither of them knew what was happening, but the presence of those vehicles meant one thing. Whoever was inside outranked them far beyond their authority to handle. The door of the first car opened. Major General Dalton stepped out. His face was flushed with anger, his eyes searching for someone he knew, without a doubt, was being mistreated. He didn't look around. He didn't acknowledge the ceremony. He moved straight toward the gate as if he had only one target in mind. Langley snapped to attention, his voice trembling. "Sir?" General Dalton didn't answer. He walked past them as if they were 2 stone pillars. There was no calm professionalism in his face, only the fury of a man witnessing something utterly unacceptable. The door of the second vehicle clicked open. A figure stepped out, and those nearby almost forgot how to breathe. General Thomas Whitaker, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, 4 stars gleaming on his shoulders like they were cutting through the air. All 3 guards froze. Rourke swallowed hard, his face draining of color. Keller felt the pulse in his collar rising so sharply he thought others might hear it. Whitaker didn't look at them. He didn't need to know who they were. He didn't need to know what they had said. His gaze stopped only when it reached the woman standing still, Rachel Hayes. And then in a moment people around them would recount for years. Whitaker walked straight to her. No explanation, no warning. He stopped. He looked at her, not with authority but with profound respect. And then he raised his hand in a salute, not a polite salute, not a salute out of courtesy, but the salute of a man who had read her record, who had heard Harper speak of her, who knew he stood before a living witness of pure courage. Major General Dalton, standing behind him, immediately followed with a salute. The female colonel beside them did the same, her arm trembling slightly, as if she were saluting a legend she had only known through combat reports. And then something no one expected happened. A company of soldiers standing nearby halted instantly. No orders, no commands. No one spoke. They all raised their hands and saluted. A line of officers farther away, captains to colonels, straightened, each lifting their arm one by one. The young soldiers carrying wreaths also stopped, hands still gripping the flowers as they joined the salute. A group of military families nearby felt their eyes well with tears, not because they knew who Rachel was, but because they understood that whoever received such a salute must have paid a great price. PFC Langley felt his legs shaking. Sergeant Rourke swallowed hard, his face white as chalk. First Sergeant Keller stood frozen, so stunned he no longer knew where to place his hands. Whitaker held the salute for a long time, longer than any protocol required. Long enough for everyone to understand this was not a ceremonial honor for the dead, but a solemn tribute to the living woman before them. When he finally lowered his hand, his voice was deep, steady, and loud enough for the entire area to hear Chief Hayes. "It's time for us to stand where we should have stood before you." Rachel didn't speak, partly because she didn't want to break the moment, partly because right now words were unnecessary. She simply inclined her head, and that slight gesture felt like the reply of someone who had lived through firestorms, yet kept humility above every achievement. And just as the wave of respect swept across the grounds, Whitaker's voice prepared to reveal the truth no one else there knew, a truth that would change the entire ceremony. After lowering his salute, General Whitaker remained standing before Rachel, leaning slightly as if signaling that what he was about to say carried a weight far beyond the ranks present at the ceremony. He looked across the crowd from senior officers to young enlisted soldiers, then let his gaze rest on the families holding folded triangular flags in their arms. And he spoke clearly, firmly, without an ounce of hesitation. "This is Chief Warrant Officer 4, Rachel Hayes, a living legend." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. Not chaos awakening. Many people turned to truly see the woman standing before them, as if noticing her for the first time. Whitaker drew in a breath, as though preparing to recount something he had carried within him for years. He began with a story heavy with battlefield memory. Most here only know Arandana Valley from a map, but one person walked into it when no one else dared. Those in uniform understood instantly. Arandana Valley was not a place for making heroes. It was where hope died unless someone dragged it back from the dark. Whitaker continued. That night, General Harper's reconnaissance unit was pinned down. No air support. No way out. A nearby officer lifted a hand to her mouth, as though the story unfolding was one she never expected to hear in public. The first bird was shot down before reaching the site. The second was recalled. Only one MEDEVAC was close, the Black Hawk, designated Dustoff 71. Those who had served in medical evacuation units or aviation knew exactly what that meant. A lone Dustoff was the last light in the darkest night. Whitaker looked at Rachel, his voice deepening. That aircraft had its tail rotor shredded on the first approach. The co-pilot was wounded. The windshield was torn open, the airframe shaking like it was about to tear itself apart. But he paused for a heartbeat, letting each word sink into the hearts of everyone listening. Chief Hayes landed the first time to pull the wounded aboard. A young soldier behind Langley clenched his fist. She landed the second time while the unit was still locked under fire. A mother with a deployed son burst into tears. And she landed a third time. This time in a condition any other pilot would call impossible. Whitaker closed his eyes for a moment, long enough to honor the memories Harper had once shared with him. She pulled 17 men out of that death zone. 17. The wind brushed through the rows of white headstones like a long exhale. General Harper lived 20 more years because of her. The entire area fell into absolute silence. No one spoke. No one moved. Somewhere behind them, an older woman, likely Harper's daughter, placed her hand over her heart, as if suddenly understanding why her father always spoke of the soldier with the wings of courage. The officers who had doubted Rachel lowered their heads, shame rising through them like a burning wave. The truth stood there, simple, unadorned, without bragging. A woman in ordinary clothes, wearing no uniform, asking for no special recognition, was the reason dozens of lives still existed today. Whitaker placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder, a gesture not between superior and subordinate, but between two soldiers who understood the cost of bravery. He spoke softly, loud enough only for those closest to hear O'Day. It isn't you who wants to stand here. It's us who owe you a place to stand. In that moment, so silent they could hear uniforms brushing against one another. Everyone understood they were not standing before a funeral attendee. They were standing before a symbol. And as that respect spread across the gathering, the next question rose not about Rachel's past, but about the lesson the oldest soldier in America intended to leave to the young ones witnessing everything. After telling the entire truth, General Whitaker turned to face First Sergeant Keller. His eyes no longer burned with explosive anger, but carried the deep disappointment of a man witnessing wrongdoing within the very ranks he trusted. His voice rang out clearly, each word striking the pride of every soldier present. You failed on every level, because you failed to see the soldier in front of you. Keller stood straight, but his shoulders trembled. He had barked orders at countless privates, had stood before many superiors, but he had never been hit at the most fundamental weakness of someone wearing the uniform, the ability to recognize the true worth of a fellow service member. He couldn't say a word. No excuses, no defense. Keller lowered his head. A small gesture, but enough to show he understood he had gone too far and been too wrong. General Whitaker allowed Keller to stand in that silence, then he turned to Rachel. His gaze now held no suspicion, only respect for someone who had fought for the lives of others without ever thinking of herself. He asked, his voice softer, but still filled with authority. Chief, what would you have them learn? The question made Rachel tilt her head slightly, as if she were not choosing an answer, but choosing a way to turn this moment into a worthy lesson for the ones who had fallen in her missions. She didn't look at Whitaker immediately. She looked at PFC Langley, the young soldier who had started all this with the eagerness of someone new to the job, but lacking the depth of true experience. Rachel's eyes held no blame, only the steady conviction of someone who had stood on the thin line between life and death. She spoke clearly, each sentence like a principle etched into her bones. The standards keep us alive. Langley flinched slightly. Her first words weren't a reprimand, but recognition of the value of discipline. The problem isn't the standard, it's who you choose to apply it to. A nearby officer covered her mouth. A simple phrase, but it tore open the entire flaw in Keller and Rourke's actions. Don't soften them, just apply them fairly, every time. The air around them seemed to settle. Her words weren't just for the 3 soldiers who had nearly thrown her out of the funeral. They were for every uniformed person standing there, those who would return to their units, to their duties, and someday face the moment of evaluating another human being. Langley swallowed hard, his eyes turning red with shame. Rourke tightened his trembling hands. Keller still bowed his head, but his shoulders sank as if he had finally dropped a piece of arrogance onto the ground. Those watching understood this wasn't just a lesson for 3 guards. It was a lesson for an entire generation of Americans in uniform. Do not let bias blind you. Do not let appearances decide the worth of the soldier standing before you. Do not forget that great stories often live inside the most ordinary people. General Whitaker nodded. No praise needed. No further explanation required. He knew Rachel had just reminded everyone of the 2 things the U.S. says. Military held above all discipline and fairness. A family behind them squeezed each other's hands tightly. A young soldier let out a quiet breath, as if releasing a burden. A female lieutenant looked at Rachel with eyes shining in genuine respect. Rachel remained silent. Because sometimes the greatest courage is not flying into gunfire. It is speaking the truth at the right moment, so it becomes a compass for those who will continue wearing the uniform after you. And as her final words settled into the hearts of those listening, quiet changes began forming in places they could not yet see. After the deeply moving funeral, what happened that day did not fade into silence like so many other stories at Arlington. It sparked a wave of awakening throughout the entire military ceremonial system. Offices across the district began reviewing procedures, examining every step in how ceremonial guards conducted themselves at high-level funerals. A new SOP was issued. Short, clear, direct. It emphasized 2 things, professional verification and avoiding bias. In the notes section, an internal report was included, edited from the incident that day. No one mentioned Rachel by name, but everyone understood that Valkyrie was not some vague legend. She was a flesh-and-blood veteran who had been turned away at the funeral of the 4-star general whose life she had once saved. No department openly pointed fingers, but the system understood that an old crease in its perception had been exposed, and it needed to be fixed. First Sergeant Keller was reassigned to a remote post. Not a demotion, but his career faded like the last echo of an artillery battery that had fired its final round. He left Arlington with no one seeing him off, leaving behind only a lesson for those who remained. As for PFC Langley, the young soldier who had pushed so hard against Rachel, a heavy feeling followed him for weeks. Not fear of punishment, not shame because a 4-star general had witnessed his mistake, but the guilt of realizing he had disrespected someone he should have stood at attention for the moment she approached. On a Saturday afternoon at the Fort Myer commissary, Rachel stood in an aisle between the shelves, holding 2 bags of coffee, unsure which one to choose. She wore a simple t-shirt and old jeans, the appearance of someone who didn't need anyone to know who she had once been on the battlefield. Langley stood at the end of the aisle gripping a small shopping basket. He hesitated, then gathered every bit of courage and stepped forward. He stopped a few steps away, his voice trembling. "Ma'am Chief, I'm sorry. I was wrong." Rachel turned. No anger, no trace of resentment. Only an expression that made Langley feel as though he were standing in front of someone who understood him more than he understood himself. She nodded gently, as if she had been waiting for the apology, not for her pride, but for the growth of a young soldier. She said softly but firmly, "You learned something that day. Don't waste the lesson." Langley looked up, his eyes slightly red. Rachel looked straight at him, not raising her voice yet. Her next words sounded like a soldier's principle anyone should carve into their memory. "See the soldier, not the package they come in." Langley swallowed hard. He nodded firmly, as if making a promise he would never be allowed to break. Rachel gave a faint smile, a rare smile from someone who had lived through enough loss to cherish even the smallest awakening in others. He walked away with straighter shoulders, and Rachel stood in the commissary aisle, placing the coffee into her cart and continuing her quiet life the same way she had lived for years since leaving the cockpit of Dustoff 71. No one stopped her to ask more. No one tried to tell her story. But the quiet change that her story sparked would follow the young soldiers who witnessed that moment for the rest of their military careers. Because every generation needs a reminder, courage doesn't have to be loud. Honor doesn't have to come with medals. And the memories of silent heroes must never be forgotten. If this story made you believe that honor and kindness never retire, share this video and subscribe to Veterans Legacy Stories so that none of their memories are ever lost.